Sometimes the sources you send over, they really get me thinking. And this time, it's not just what's being said, but who's saying it. Frank Kendall, former Secretary of the Air Force. And he is not holding back.
Yeah, you're telling me. He rarely does.
Exactly. So we've got excerpts here from an MSNBC interview and then also a New York Times op-ed, both kind of focused on the same, I guess you could say, alarming trend. Kendall is suggesting that the Trump administration's dismissal of these top military leaders, especially these judge advocate generals, well, it could be a sign of something a lot bigger, something a lot more troubling.
And it's interesting you say that, about who's speaking, because Kendall's background here, I think it really matters. I mean, West Point graduate, Army veteran, he even served as the Undersecretary of Defense. This isn't someone who's, known for jumping to conclusions or anything.
Right. He doesn't seem like a partisan kind of guy.
No, not at all.
All right. So we've got this seasoned, level-headed guy, and he's using terms like rogue president and war on the rule of law.
I think for anyone listening, the first question is, what does all that even mean? Like, what makes a president rogue?
Well, Kendall's argument, it seems to focus on just how unusual these dismissals were. You see, we're not talking about, your typical administrative changes.
Right.
Or firings based on, performance or something. They were experienced people, apolitical military professionals, and suddenly they're removed, and there's no clear reason given.
So it's not just changing of the guard, right? Something more deliberate is happening here.
That's what he seems to be implying.
Okay.
And Kendall seems particularly concerned about these judge advocate generals, the JAGs, yeah. For our listener, we should probably explain what they do, It's kind of central to Kendall's point here.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Because for someone who's not, deep in the weeds of military structure, judge advocate general, it doesn't really tell you much. So what's so special about these JAGs? Well, think of them as like the legal backbone of the military. They're the ones who enforce the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which, and this is important, means they can refuse orders from the president himself if they think those orders are unlawful.
Wait, hold on. They can actually say no to the commander-in-chief?
That's right. Their oath is to the Constitution, not to any one person.
So they're like the ultimate check on presidential power, but just within the military.
You could say that, yes.
Mm.
And that's exactly what makes their dismissals so unsettling. Kendall suggests, that this could be an attempt to kind of clear the way for actions that maybe legally aren't so sound.
I mean, it's like firing the referee in the middle of a game because, you don't like how they're calling the fouls. What's the point of having rules if you can just get rid of whoever's enforcing them, right?
Exactly. And Kendall uses this really specific example, Lieutenant General Charles Plummer. And actually, he praises Plummer, for giving sound professional legal advice. So the question is, why was Plummer targeted?
Yeah. I mean, if he was doing his job well, what's the motive here?
Right. And that's where Kendall's warning about a war on the rule of law, I think it starts to make more sense. See, he's not just worried about these individuals being fired. It's about what it says, I guess you could say, about a larger commitment to these legal norms and processes.
There's a quote from Trump that Kendall puts in the op-ed that honestly, it kind of gave me chills. He says, he who saves his country does not violate any law. Like, where do we even begin to unpack that?
Right. It's a really fascinating quote because it suggests a view of the law, a view that's pretty different from how America is designed to work, right? Like we have this idea of rule of law, which means that nobody, not even the president, is above the law. Everyone's going to play by the same rules. But that quote, it kind of implies that, that saving the country could be a reason to break the law.
And that's where, what Kendall's saying about a rogue president, it starts to really click. Like, if someone believes they're acting in the best interest of the country, they might feel like, okay, maybe I can bend the rules or even wag them. But that's a slippery slope, right?
It is a slippery slope. And it's especially worrisome in the military where the stakes are so high. And the potential for abuse of power, it's enormous.
Yeah. And I mean, to kind of illustrate that, Kendall brings up this story about a JAG lawyer. At Guantanamo Bay, this lawyer was defending, even clients who weren't popular, defending them to the fullest extent of the law, just out of this sense of duty, this commitment to the process. What do you think? Why did he put that story in there?
Because it's a great example of what rule of law actually looks like, even when it's hard, even when it's not like the popular thing to do. Upholding the law, it's essential to a democracy that works. And I think the story shows how important it is to have these independent legal voices in the military, people who will stand up and say no when they need to, even to the most powerful people.
So it's not just blind obedience. It's about having that moral compass, that legal compass, guiding every decision, even in really tough spots.
Exactly.
But Kendall doesn't just, stop at raising the alarm. He actually calls on all Americans to acknowledge and respond. What does that even mean? Like, what can a regular person actually do when faced with something this big?
A good question. And it's probably something our listeners thinking too, okay, this is scary, but like, what do I actually do? And the interesting thing is, Kendall addresses this head on in the comments of the Times piece. He responds to a reader who asks that exact question, what can we do?
So he actually gives people concrete advice.
Oh, yeah. And his answer is, it's surprisingly straightforward. He says, look, you can use your voice, contact your representatives, stay informed, and stay engaged. He really hammers home the point that this isn't about, Democrats versus Republicans. This is about defending the core of American democracy. Basically saying, don't be silent. Don't just sit back. Make your voice heard.
So knowledge is the first step, but action is what really matters. You can't just be aware of the problem. You got to do something about it.
Absolutely. And I think that's the power of Kendall's message. He's not just presenting a problem. He's offering a way forward. He's saying, here's what's happening. Here's why it's dangerous. And here's what you can do about it.
It's one thing to talk about these, big ideas, rule of law, rogue president, all that. But it's something else to actually imagine what it would look like if it kept happening. Like, what are the real world consequences,
That's where it gets, pretty unsettling. If we stay focused on the military for a second, think about it this way. You've got the JAGs. They're supposed to make sure everything the military does is legal, right? But what if they're pressured into, giving legal cover for stuff that's actually questionable?
Right.
Or even worse, what if they're just told to look the other way?
So you're saying we could end up with, unlawful detentions, use of force that's way over the line, all because there's nobody left to say, hold on, this isn't right.
It's definitely a possibility. And we got to remember, this isn't just about, what happens on some battlefield overseas. There are laws in place, like the Posse Comitatus Act, that limit what the military can even do here in America. But even those laws, they can be interpreted in different ways, They could be sidestepped.
Okay, wait, back up a second. Posse Comitatus Act. For folks who aren't, military law experts, break that down for us. What is that?
It's basically a law from, way back in the 1800s. And it says the federal government can't use the military like it's their own personal police force.
Yeah.
It's supposed to make sure the military isn't turned against American citizens here at home. But, and this is what Kendall's getting at, if we start messing with the rule of law, even those safeguards, they could be at risk.
So we're not just talking about things going wrong in some other country. We're talking about the possibility of the military being used against Americans right here.
It's a scary thought. But it's one that Kendall seems to think, it could actually happen if this war on the rule of law keeps going.
Wow. Okay, so that's a pretty terrifying scenario. But it also makes you wonder, if it can happen with the military, could it happen in other parts of the government too?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about how our government is set up. We've got this whole system of checks and balances, right?
Right.
So no one branch gets too powerful. But those checks and balances, they only work if everybody is committed to following the rules.
Mm-hmm.
If that commitment starts to weaken, the whole system, it could start falling apart.
It's like, when you pull on a loose thread in a sweater and the whole thing starts to unravel?
Exactly. And what happens when it all unravels? More corruption, people stop trusting the government, and eventually they lose faith in democracy itself.
Okay, so we've established that this is a big problem with some potentially huge consequences. But what can we as, regular people actually do about it? It feels like we're up against some pretty powerful forces. Where do we even start?
Well, like Kendall said, awareness is the first step. Got to understand what the threat is, recognize when it's happening. You can't fight something if you don't even know it's there.
Right. Ignorance is not bliss in this case.
Not at all.
So what comes after awareness? How do we turn knowing about it into actually doing something?
Kendall suggests a bunch of things. Contact your representatives, sign petitions, get involved with groups that are, out there trying to protect the rule of law. Mm-hmm. His message is, don't be passive. Don't just watch this happen. Make yourself heard.
So using our voices, our votes, holding those in power accountable, making sure they know we're watching, and we won't stand for any funny business when it comes to the rule of law.
That's it. And remember, this isn't about being a Democrat or a Republican. The rule of law, that's the foundation of our democracy. It's something we should all be able to agree on. It protects all of us.
You know, there's a part in Kendall's op-ed where he talks about how important a free press is. He's basically saying we need to be supporting, defending those journalists who are doing this tough, sometimes dangerous work of holding the powerful accountable.
He's totally right. A free press, a press that can do its job without being controlled, that's essential for a democracy to function. Journalists, they're like watchdogs, right? They're digging into wrongdoing, informing the public, making sure those in power don't get away with anything.
Oh.
If anyone tries to silence them, discredit them, that's a direct attack on our democracy.
And it's not just about, like, cheering for journalists. It's about being smart about the information we're getting right. We got to be critical, aware of our own biases, willing to look at things from different angles.
Oh, 100%. Blindly believing what you hear,
Yeah.
even if it's from someone you trust, that can be dangerous. We got to be critical thinkers, question things, be willing to change our minds when we see new evidence.
Kendall also mentions education, learning about these things ourselves and teaching the next generation. We need to understand our rights, our responsibilities as citizens, and we got to pass that on, teach our kids the value of democracy and the rule of law. It's not something we can just take for granted.
So important. Democracy, it needs people to participate. It needs people who are willing to have those tough conversations, who are committed to making it work, even when it's, inconvenient or uncomfortable. And we got to pass that on to the next generation if we want it to survive.
You know, it's easy to hear all this and feel overwhelmed. It's a big problem, right? And you might think, well, what can I do? It won't make a difference. What would you say to someone who's feeling that way?
I get it. It's a natural feeling. But here's the thing. Every voice matters. Every phone call, every letter, every conversation, it can help shift things, even a little bit. It's like that saying, right? What's the use of a single drop of water, a single grain of sand? But a million drops together, that's a river. A million grains of sand, that's a desert.
Right. One person, it might not seem like much. But when we come together, all those small actions, they can make a big difference. It's about collective action, about communities getting involved. It's realizing that we're all in this together.
Exactly. We're not alone in this. There are millions of Americans who believe in the rule of law and who are ready to fight for it. And when we all stand together, raise our voices, that's when we become a force to be reckoned with.
Listening to you talk about this, it really hits home that the rule of law, it's not just some idea in a textbook, It's what protects our freedom, our rights, our whole way of life. It's like the foundation everything else is built on.
You got it. The rule of law, it's the base of a society that's fair and just. It makes sure everyone's treated equally, no matter how rich they are, what their status is, who they know in the government.
And without it, we're all vulnerable. We're all at risk.
100%. Without the rule of law, it's the powerful, the corrupt, the bullies. They get to call the shots. We're at their mercy, and they can use their power for themselves, even if it hurts everyone else.
Okay, you've officially got me fired up. Time to write my congressperson, call my senator, maybe even join a protest or two. This isn't something we can just sit back and let happen.
That's what I like to hear. This is our democracy. It's worth fighting for, worth defending. We got to demand that our leaders uphold the very principles that this country was founded on.
And it's not just for us, right? It's for future generations. We're fighting to keep those ideals of liberty and justice alive so that our kids, our grandkids, they inherit a country where those things still matter.
That's a powerful thought. It's not just about today, it's about tomorrow. It's about making sure this American experiment, this idea of people governing themselves, that it keeps working.
I think we've covered a lot here today, but it also feels like we've only scratched the surface of this whole issue. It's so important, but it's also really complicated. Before we move on, any last thoughts for our listener?
The biggest takeaway, I think, is to remember that the rule of law, it's not just some abstract legal thing. It's the very heart of our society. It protects us from tyranny. It makes sure everyone has a fair shot. And it lets us live in a society where everyone can thrive. And we all have a responsibility to defend it.
That's a perfect way to put it. We'll be sure to link to all the sources we talked about in the show notes. So if you want to dive deeper into what Kendall's saying or just learn more about all this, you can. But for now, let's all take a minute to think about what we've learned and how we can each do our part to protect the rule of law. It's easy to get stuck on, like, all the bad stuff that could happen. But we should remember, the rule of law, it's not just about stopping bad things. It's also about, building a better society, right? One that's more just, more fair, where everybody has a chance to do well.
Yeah. It's like, imagine building a house, right? You could build it just to survive a hurricane. Or you could build it to feel safe, comfortable, like a place where you can be yourself. And the rule of law, It's kind of like building that second kind of house. It's about making a space where everyone can thrive, where it doesn't matter who you know or how much power you have. What matters is like your own hard work, your own skills.
And that's what makes all this so worrying, right? Because if that foundation starts to crumble, it's not just some abstract idea that's in trouble. It's the whole fabric of how we live together.
Yeah.
Like, what kind of future are we even building if we can't agree on the basic rules of the game?
That's it. That's exactly what Kendall is trying to get people to see. This isn't just some political back and forth. It's about the future of our country, our democracy, what we're leaving for our kids and grandkids.
He's saying we got to take it seriously, get involved, push back against this erosion of something so basic to who we are. But how do we actually deal with that? What does that fight even look like?
Well, like we've talked about, it starts with knowing what's going on, educating ourselves, and telling others about why the rule of law matters. But it can't stop there. We got to speak up, challenge people in power, make sure they're held accountable for what they do. We got to be active participants in our democracy, not just sit back and watch.
So it's about making our voices heard, whether that's through voting, calling our representatives, organizing in our communities, supporting those groups that are out there on the front lines, defending the rule of law. We all have a part to play in protecting our democracy.
Absolutely. And remember, we're not doing this alone. There are so many people, so many organizations working so hard to protect the rule of law, the Constitution, to make sure justice wins. And when we all come together, stand together, that's when real change happens.
And even if we don't see results right away, even if it feels like we're pushing a boulder uphill, we got to remember, progress. It happens little by little. Every step we take, every time we speak up, every action we take, it adds to this bigger movement towards a more just and fair society.
You know, something that really strikes me about all this is the rule of law. It's not just about preventing the bad stuff. It's also about making good things possible, creating a society where everyone has a real chance to, like, be their best selves, to chase their dreams, to live a life without fear, you know?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's not just about playing defense. It's about creating something good, something worth fighting for, building a society that lives up to our best ideals, where justice, fairness, equality, they're not just words, they're actually how we live.
Exactly. And I think that's something to hold on to, especially when it feels like those ideals are under attack. It's a reminder that fighting for the rule of law, it's really about fighting for a better future, for us, for our kids, for generations to come.
Well, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. We've covered a lot, and I'm sure there's a lot for everyone to think about. But before we go, I want to leave you with one last thought.
Well,
if Kendall's right, if we really are in a war on the rule of law, well, we can't lose. The stakes are just too high. What kind of country are we going to be? What's going to happen to our democracy? That's what's on the line.
it's a fight that needs all of us to step up, learn about it, get involved, make our voices heard. It's going to take courage, conviction, and never giving up on the things that, that really make America special.
So get out there, have those tough conversations, even when they're uncomfortable. Challenge the people in charge. Support the groups that are doing the hard work day in and day out. And never underestimate the power of your own voice. Our democracy, it depends on us. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a really important conversation.
And remember, this is just the beginning. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep fighting for the world you want to see.